They call Islam the religion of peace. Politicians say it, religious leaders repeat it, even critics soften their language with it. But here's the harsh truth. If you open Islam's own sacred texts, if you follow the bloodstains of history, and if you look at the way it operates in the modern world, peace is the last word you'd honestly use. This isn't about attacking Muslims as people. It's not about mocking individuals who grew up in faith communities. It's about confronting the story Islam tells about itself, and the story the world has been pressured to believe. The claim that Islam is peaceful is not just misleading. It is one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in history, and the cost of believing it is measured in lives. The phrase, religion of peace, didn't come from the Quran. It didn't come from Muhammad. It was popularized after 9/11 as a defensive slogan to protect Islam's reputation when the world saw planes crashing into towers and heard Allahu Akbar echoing over footage of carnage. But here's the key question. If a religion needs a PR slogan to insist it's peaceful, what does that tell you? Let's go back to the source, the Quran itself. Over and over, the text doesn't describe peace as its primary goal. It describes submission. That's literally what the word Islam means, submission to God. Peace, in Islamic terms, isn't about coexistence with others. It's about the world submitting under Allah's law. Peace only comes once everyone either believes, pays tribute, or is crushed. From the very beginning, Islam spread not by peaceful preaching, but by the sword. Muhammad himself led raids, battles, and executions. His successors expanded empires through conquest. Entire civilizations were absorbed, taxed, or destroyed in the name of faith. This isn't revisionist history. This is Islam's own history, proudly recorded in its own chronicles. And yet, defenders will tell you, no, you're taking verses out of context. Islam is about peace. Jihad is only defensive. But the deeper you dig into the Quran and Hadith, the more that excuse collapses, because the context makes it worse, not better. If Islam is a religion of peace, its foundational text, the Quran, should be overflowing with verses about compassion, coexistence, and harmony. But open its pages and you'll notice something else. The Quran doesn't talk about peace as freedom, dignity, or safety for all. It defines peace as the condition after everyone submits to Allah. In other words, peace equals surrender. Over and over, the Quran divides the world into two camps, the believers and the unbelievers, those who submit and those who resist. And the instructions toward the unbelievers are rarely tolerant. Surah 9:29 orders Muslims to fight Jews and Christians until they submit and pay the jizya tax. Surah 9:5, often called the verse of the sword, commands, slay the idolaters wherever you find them. These are not poetic metaphors, they are directives. Critics will say you're cherry-picking. These verses are about specific wars, specific enemies, not universal commands. But here's the trap. Islamic scholarship itself doesn't treat these verses as isolated. Classical jurists from the earliest centuries interpreted them as standing instructions, the legal basis for jihad. And many Islamic scholars still defend them today. The so-called context defense collapses once you realize that the authoritative context is war, conquest, and submission. And then there's the doctrine of nasakh, abrogation. The Quran itself teaches that later verses override earlier ones. What does that mean? The softer, peaceful verses from Muhammad's early career in Mecca
when he was weak, preaching tolerance, were later abrogated by the harsher, militant verses revealed in Medina once he held power. This isn't speculation, it's Islamic orthodoxy. When a peaceful verse clashes with a violent one, the violent one wins. But maybe you think this is all just interpretation. Surely the Quran still has a strong core of mercy and compassion. Yes, it does, but notice who that mercy applies to: the believers. Again and again, Allah is merciful to those who believe. But to the unbelievers, the Quran promises humiliation in this life and eternal fire in the next. That's not peace. That's the language of domination. And if the Quran alone sounds harsh, wait until we get to the Hadith, the collected sayings and actions of Muhammad himself. Because if the Quran lays the blueprint, the Hadith shows us how it was lived. And the picture that emerges is not just of a religion that permits violence, but one that models it as sacred duty.
The Quran gives commands, but the Hadith shows how Muhammad and his companions carried them out. And in Islam, Muhammad isn't just a prophet, he's the perfect model. What he did is considered the highest form of morality, which means the violence he engaged in isn't seen as a flaw, it's seen as an example to follow. Sahih al-Bukhari, one of the most authoritative collections, records Muhammad saying, "I have been commanded to fight the people until they testify that none has the right to be worshipped but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah." This isn't about defending against attackers, this is about forcing belief. The act of fighting, violent compulsion, is framed as divine duty. The Hadith also records Muhammad personally ordering assassinations of critics, including poets who mocked him. He led raids on caravans, he oversaw the execution of entire groups of prisoners, such as the men of the Jewish tribe Banu Qurayza, who were beheaded after surrendering. These aren't obscure fringe stories, they're celebrated episodes in Islamic tradition. Even more telling, the Hadith glorifies those who die in battle for Islam. Paradise, according to multiple narrations, is guaranteed for the martyr. And it's not just paradise in abstract terms, it's a paradise described with material rewards, like rivers of wine and virgins. This transforms violence into a ticket to eternal pleasure. Peace isn't the reward, war is the path to reward. And because Hadith forms the basis of Sharia law, these violent precedents aren't just stories, they're precedents with legal weight. Classical scholars didn't read them as history, they read them as instruction. That's why Islamic jurisprudence developed detailed rules for war, conquest, taxation of non-Muslims, and punishments for apostasy. This isn't accidental, it's baked in. When defenders say Islam is peaceful, jihad is only defensive, the Hadith itself contradicts them. It shows a prophet who attacked first, who punished unbelief with death, who saw war as a holy mission. If your model of perfection is a warlord, how can the religion built around him ever be honestly called peaceful? And yet some will still argue, that was the 7th century, things are different now. But history tells a different story, because the early caliphs, Muhammad's successors, didn't water these teachings down. They doubled down. And what followed wasn't peace, it was empire.
The early Islamic conquests were not only territorial, but often brutally enforced under the banner of spreading the faith. Armies moved rapidly across the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and into parts of Asia, leaving behind campaigns marked by extreme violence, forced conversions, and the subjugation of local populations. Execution of Abu Afaq, 624 CE. Abu Afaq, a 120-year-old Jewish poet, was reportedly killed for composing verses that criticized Muhammad and his followers. According to Islamic sources, Muhammad is said to have asked, "Who will deal with this rascal for me?" Salim ibn Umar, a companion of Muhammad, responded and killed Abu Afaq during the night. Upon hearing of the execution, Muhammad allegedly expressed approval, stating, "You have helped God and his apostle, O Umar." Execution of Uzma bint Marwan, 624 CE. Uzma bint Marwan, a poetess who criticized Muhammad, was assassinated by a follower of Muhammad. According to Islamic sources, she was killed in her home while nursing her infant. The assassination was reportedly carried out under the direct command of Muhammad. This event is recorded in Islamic historical texts, including the works of Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari. Siege and mass execution of Banu Qurayza, 627 CE. In 627 CE, following the Battle of the Trench, the Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayza was besieged by Muslim forces. After their surrender, the tribe's fate was decided by Sa'd ibn Mu'az, who ruled that the men be executed, the women and children enslaved, and the property divided among the Muslims. Historical records indicate that between 600 and 900 men were beheaded, with their bodies buried in trenches. This event is documented in Islamic sources, including the works of Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari. Execution of Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, 624 CE. Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf, a Jewish poet and merchant, was known for composing satirical poems mocking Muhammad. He is said to have incited others against Muhammad, leading to his execution. Muhammad reportedly approved the killing, stating, "Who will rid me of this man?" A companion, Muhammad ibn Mislama, volunteered and killed Ka'b ibn al-Ashraf. Execution of Kurfa, 629 CE. In 629 CE, during the campaign led by Zayd ibn Haritha against the Banu Fazarah tribe, the elderly woman Kurfa was captured. According to Islamic historical sources, she was subjected to a gruesome execution. Her legs were tied to 2 camels, which were then driven in opposite directions, tearing her body apart. Her severed head was subsequently paraded through the streets of Medina. This account is detailed in the works of early Islamic historians such as Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari. These campaigns of conquest set a precedent. Expansion and religious enforcement were intertwined, and brutality was often a tool to secure loyalty. This pattern would continue not only in new territories, but also in enforcing internal discipline among Muslims themselves.
Before considering large-scale conquests, it is important to examine acts of violence and coercion carried out directly under Muhammad's leadership and that of his closest companions. Sources recount battles, punitive measures, and harsh punishments used to consolidate authority and enforce obedience. 1. The conquest of the Levant and Syria, 632 to 638 CE. After Muhammad's death in 632 CE, the Rashidun caliphs launched campaigns to expand Islamic rule into the Levant and Syria. Under Caliph Abu Bakr and later Umar ibn al-Khattab, cities such as Damascus, Jerusalem, and Aleppo were besieged. Contemporary and later sources, including al-Tabari and Baladuri, report that these campaigns involved massacres of resisting populations, forced conversions, and destruction of pagan and Christian sites. Large segments of urban populations were killed or enslaved, while dissenting tribal leaders were executed. 2. The conquest of North Africa, 647 to 709 CE. The expansion into North Africa, especially modern-day Tunisia, under generals like Uqba ibn Nafi, involved widespread violence against local Berber tribes. Uqba is historically noted for brutal enforcement of Islam, including punitive campaigns against resistant tribes. Reports suggest Uqba decapitated local tribal leaders and used fear to consolidate control, reportedly telling survivors, "When I return, you better be Muslims." Multiple cities were razed and dissenting populations were massacred or enslaved. Sources,
Ibn Khaldun, al-Baladuri, and modern historical analyses of early Islamic North Africa. 3. Persian campaigns and the fall of the Sassanid Empire, 633 to 654 CE. The Islamic conquest of Persia saw major cities, including Ctesiphon and Estakhr, fall after sieges and mass killings. Historians like al-Tabari document widespread slaughter of soldiers and civilians, with thousands executed for resistance. Temples and Zoroastrian religious centers were destroyed or repurposed. The Sassanid nobility was often executed or exiled to consolidate Islamic authority.
4. Sind and India, 712 to 786 CE. The campaigns led by Muhammad bin Qasim into Sind, modern Pakistan, included extensive massacres and enslavement of local populations. Contemporary sources and chroniclers, including al-Baladuri, report mass executions of resisting warriors, punitive measures against local rulers, and forced imposition of jizya, or tax, on non-Muslims. Some accounts describe organized beheadings during sieges, as well as destruction of Hindu and Buddhist temples, consolidating Islamic dominance in the region. 5. Expansion into the Iberian Peninsula, 711 to 718 CE. The Umayyad conquest of Hispania began under Tariq ibn Ziyad, who led Muslim armies into the Visigothic kingdom. Chronicles report massacres of resisting towns, mass enslavement of populations, and destruction of churches. Non-Muslims were often forced to convert or pay tribute under threat of execution. Historical sources: al-Makari, Ibn Abd el-Hakam. 6. Spread into Central Asia and the Caucasus, 8th century CE. Islamic expansion into regions like Khorasan, Transoxiana, and the Caucasus involved repeated military campaigns with documented massacres of resisting populations, destruction of religious and cultural sites, and imposition of Islamic rule through force. Reports from al-Tabari and later historians describe mass killings of resisting rulers and civilians intended to enforce submission to the caliphate. While these actions shaped the early foundation of Islam, the legacy of internal enforcement would become just as critical as external expansion. What followed were systematic efforts to suppress dissent, ensure conformity, and maintain centralized control over both beliefs and behavior.
Beyond conquest, the Islamic leadership faced challenges from within: tribes resisting taxes, sects disagreeing over theology, and populations unwilling to submit. The response was often overwhelming force, illustrating that the spread of Islam was as much about internal domination as it was about external expansion. 1. The Ridda Wars, 632 to 633 CE. Immediately after Muhammad's death, several Arabian tribes renounced Islam, refusing to pay zakat, the mandatory alms or charity required of Muslims, or acknowledge the authority of Caliph Abu Bakr. The Ridda Wars, or Wars of Apostasy, were launched to force these tribes back into submission. Historical accounts, including al-Tabari, report mass executions of rebellious tribal leaders, widespread killings in villages, and punitive measures designed to terrorize populations into obedience. Entire clans were sometimes annihilated to prevent further rebellion. 2. Suppression of the Kharijites, 7th century CE. The Kharijites, an early Islamic sect that opposed the ruling caliphs over political and theological disagreements, faced brutal suppression. Battles in Iraq and Arabia resulted in mass killings of dissenting Kharijites. Surviving rebels were hunted down, and executions were carried out without trial to eliminate ideological threats to Umayyad
and later Abbasid rule. 3. Ibn al-Ash'ath rebellion in Iraq, 699 to 701 CE. Led by Abd al-Rahman ibn al-Ash'ath, a major revolt against Umayyad governor al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf was violently crushed. Contemporary accounts describe tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians killed in battle, executed, or imprisoned. Al-Hajjaj used terror tactics, including decapitations and public displays of punishment to reassert control over the Iraqi provinces and deter future uprisings.
4. Suppression of Shia movements, 7th to 8th century CE. After the death of Ali ibn Abi Talib and the rise of Umayyad rule, Shia Muslims faced systematic persecution. The Battle of Karbala, 680 CE, saw the massacre of Hussein ibn Ali and his supporters. Survivors were enslaved, and entire families were killed. This event became a defining example of violent repression of dissenting Islamic interpretations. 5. The Berber Revolts in North Africa, 8th century CE. When Umayyad authorities imposed heavy taxes and enforced Islamic conformity on Berber tribes across Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, revolts erupted. Sources report mass killings of rebels, execution of tribal leaders, and large-scale enslavement. These campaigns were designed to enforce both religious and political obedience. 6. The Almohad and later Caliphate suppressions in the 12th to 13th century CE. During the Almohad dynasty in North Africa and Spain, internal enforcement became increasingly harsh. Those considered heretical, including non-conforming Muslims, Jews, and Christians, faced execution or forced conversion. Chronicles describe public beatings, mass executions, and city-wide purges aimed at consolidating control and enforcing strict religious conformity. The repeated use of violence to suppress dissent did not just consolidate power, it reshaped societies, laws, and cultural norms. These patterns of internal enforcement laid the groundwork for the broader social and religious impacts that followed, affecting generations and the very structure of the Islamic world. The systematic use of violence and coercion to enforce Islam didn't just conquer lands, it reshaped societies. Laws, customs, education, and social hierarchies were altered to reflect the demands of religious authority. What began as military conquest evolved into pervasive cultural control, embedding obedience and conformity into everyday life. Legal and social structures. Sharia, Islamic law, became the foundation of governance in conquered territories. While it promised justice and moral order, it was often applied selectively to consolidate power. Communities were organized around religious loyalty. Dissenters faced harsh penalties, from fines and exile to execution. Non-Muslims were subjected to jizya, a tax levied on non-Muslims under Muslim rule, enforcing both subordination and religious hierarchy. Over time, these laws curtailed freedom of thought and reinforced the dominance of the ruling elites. Cultural and intellectual control. Religious authorities controlled education, literature, and historical narratives. Texts praising or documenting violence were preserved and glorified, while opposing viewpoints were censored. Scholars who questioned the official religious line risked persecution or death. Knowledge and art became instruments for reinforcing religious conformity rather than fostering independent thought. 3. Impact on women and minority groups. Women and minority populations were particularly affected, Laws and social norms enforced gender hierarchies, restricting freedoms and codifying inequality. Religious minorities, including Christians, Jews, and others, were marginalized, forcibly converted, or expelled. In some regions, traditions of public humiliation, punishment, or execution were used to deter resistance and maintain social control. 4. Psychological and generational effects. The enforcement of obedience and the normalization of fear had long-lasting psychological consequences. Children were raised under strict religious discipline, instilling submission, guilt, and suspicion of independent thinking. Entire generations grew up equating faith with obedience, doubt with betrayal, and deviation with punishment. This cultural conditioning ensured that compliance was not just enforced externally, but internalized. The effects of these policies were not limited to the immediate victims, they shaped civilizations. As time passed, the interweaving of power, culture, and religion created a society where questioning authority became dangerous, and where the promises of Islam were inseparable from the consequences of enforcement. The next section will examine how these patterns of power and violence extended into empire building and the long-term consolidation of authority across diverse regions.
The expansion of Islam did not end with early conquests or internal enforcement. Over centuries, it grew into vast empires, stretching from Spain to India, North Africa to Southeast Asia. These empires consolidated power by intertwining religion, law, and governance, creating systems where obedience to Islam was inseparable from loyalty to the state. 1. Umayyad Caliphate, 661 to 750 CE. The Umayyads established the first hereditary Islamic dynasty centered in Damascus. They expanded aggressively into North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and Central Asia. Historical records, including Al-Tabari, describe mass killings of resistant populations, forced conversions, and punitive campaigns to secure control over new territories. Cultural and religious institutions were reshaped to support central authority, and dissent was ruthlessly suppressed, setting a precedent for future Islamic empires. 2. Abbasid Caliphate, 750–1258 CE. The Abbasids moved the capital to Baghdad and promoted a golden age of science, philosophy, and trade. Yet, alongside intellectual flourishing, they maintained strict control over religion and society. Rebellions were crushed, sects deemed heretical faced executions, and the political use of religious legitimacy reinforced the caliph's authority. Even within Islamic scholarship, deviation from orthodox teachings could be punished, ensuring that knowledge itself supported imperial and religious power. 3. Almohads and North African enforcement, 12th to 13th century CE. In North Africa and Al-Andalus, Spain, the Almohad dynasty enforced rigid religious conformity. Non-Muslims, including Jews and Christians, faced forced conversion, exile, or death. Histories describe mass executions, public punishments, and citywide purges to enforce orthodoxy. These campaigns ensured that religious authority underpinned political control, embedding fear and obedience into the population. 4. Expansion into the Indian subcontinent, 8th to 18th century CE. Islamic expansion into India involved repeated military campaigns, notably by the Delhi Sultanate and later the Mughal Empire. Historical accounts detail large-scale massacres, temple destruction, and forced conversions in regions resisting Islamic rule. Chroniclers like Ziauddin Barani and Firishta document instances of mass beheadings, enslavement, and suppression of Hindu and Buddhist populations.
these campaigns were justified as enforcing Islamic authority, often under the banner of jihad. 5. Long-term consolidation and influence. Across all these regions, the combination of military conquest, religious enforcement, and cultural control ensured that Islamic authority was deeply entrenched. Cities, legal systems, and educational institutions were aligned with religious orthodoxy. Social hierarchies favored Muslims, dissenters were marginalized or punished, and generations grew up absorbing norms of obedience and submission. Even in later periods, when empires waned, the social and religious structures established during these expansions continued to shape culture, law, and politics.
The patterns established through empire building, centralized power, religious enforcement, and cultural domination have had enduring effects. To understand the modern influence of Islam, it is essential to see how these historical practices translated into contemporary social, political, and legal systems. The next section will examine Islam's enduring global influence, highlighting both its cultural reach and the ongoing tensions between orthodoxy and dissent. The historical patterns of conquest, enforcement, and consolidation did not vanish with the fall of empires. The legacy of Islam's expansion continues to influence modern societies, politics, and international relations. Understanding these effects requires examining how religious authority interacts with power in today's world. 1. Political influence and governance. In many countries with majority Muslim populations, Islamic law, Sharia, continues to shape legal systems, civil rights, and public policy. From Saudi Arabia's strict enforcement of moral codes to Pakistan's blasphemy laws, governments leverage religious authority to maintain social order and political control. Even in more secular states, religious groups influence legislation, education, and societal norms, demonstrating the enduring power of orthodoxy. 2. Extremist movements and violent enforcement. The historical precedent of using violence to enforce religious obedience persists in extremist movements. Groups like ISIS, Boko Haram, and Al-Qaeda claim direct inspiration from early Islamic practices and texts, justifying mass killings, beheadings, and persecution of minorities. These modern campaigns echo centuries of coercion, illustrating that the methods of enforcing belief have adapted, but the underlying patterns remain. 3. Cultural and social impacts. Islamic orthodoxy continues to affect gender roles, freedom of expression, and minority rights. In some regions, apostasy and blasphemy are punishable by law. Criticism of religious practices is often met with social ostracism, imprisonment, or violence. Communities shaped by centuries of religious enforcement exhibit internalized norms of obedience and submission, making dissent socially and personally costly. 4. Globalization and migration. With migration and the global spread of Islamic communities, historical practices interact with new cultural contexts. Tensions arise when orthodox norms meet liberal or secular societies, producing conflicts over freedom, law, and cultural integration. Understanding this requires awareness of both historical context and contemporary socio-political dynamics. 5. Legacy and education. Education systems in many Islamic majority countries continue to emphasize religious orthodoxy over critical thinking, mirroring historical methods of social control. Textbooks often glorify past conquests, present religious law as absolute, and discourage questioning. This perpetuates a cycle of indoctrination, ensuring that historical patterns influence future generations. The modern influence of Islam is inseparable from its historical patterns of conquest, enforcement, and cultural consolidation. To fully understand its impact, one must recognize both the depth of historical coercion and its continuing effects on societies worldwide. The final section will provide a reflective conclusion connecting the historical narrative to present-day implications and personal freedom. Having traced Islam's expansion, enforcement, and enduring influence, the picture is clear. What began as religious conquest evolved into a complex system of power, obedience, and cultural control. Understanding this history is not an exercise in condemnation for its own sake. It is a pathway to clarity, awareness, and informed engagement with the present. The human cost of enforcement. The historical record is filled with violence, coercion, and suppression of dissent. From early conquests in Arabia, North Africa, and the Indian subcontinent to modern extremist movements, the consequences of religious enforcement have been profound. Lives lost, cultures reshaped, freedoms curtailed. These patterns were not incidental. They were embedded in the very systems designed to enforce belief. 2. The enduring legacy. Even in contemporary societies, social norms, legal frameworks, and educational practices continue to reflect centuries of religious authority. Compliance is often rewarded, questioning punished, and deviation stigmatized. Recognizing this legacy is crucial for understanding why certain practices persist and why reform faces resistance. 3. Lessons for personal and collective freedom. Awareness of history provides the tools to resist coercion, challenge dogma, and reclaim intellectual and moral autonomy. Critical thinking, questioning, and evidence-based reasoning are antidotes to inherited authority. Just as historical enforcement shaped generations, conscious reflection can shape a future defined by choice rather than submission. 4. A call to examine systems, not just belief. The focus should not be on vilifying individuals of faith, but on understanding the structures and narratives that allowed obedience and violence to flourish. Religious systems wield enormous power, and that power has real-world consequences. Questioning those systems is both responsible and necessary for a society that values freedom, accountability, and justice. 5. Possibility beyond faith enforcement. History shows that human societies are capable of morality, compassion, and meaning without religious coercion. Ethical behavior, empathy, and justice do not require dogma. They emerge from human experience and conscious choice. By disentangling life from imposed religious structures, societies and individuals gain the freedom to define values, justice, and purpose on their own terms. The story of Islam, like that of all historical movements, is complex, marked by achievement, culture, and intellect, but also by coercion, violence, and control. Understanding the full spectrum of its history allows us to confront uncomfortable truths without denial. The lessons are clear. Vigilance, critical thinking, and moral courage are the tools with which we navigate inherited systems of power. History may shape us, but it does not have to bind us. The opportunity lies in seeing clearly and acting freely. Knowledge is power. Questioning is responsibility. Freedom is choice. The harsh truths of history illuminate the path to understanding, and the courage to face them is the first step toward shaping a future unbound by unquestioned authority.